still had, you did start getting attacks on Jews in the 50s, so all of the...
right, but it's different, and it was done for totally different reasons.
Right.
Those things are not related. But there was a sincere attempt on the top of on the part of the very top Bolsheviks, and it was actually driven by the Lenin himself. The attempt to replace old rituals with new rituals, and the replacing of the Judaism with the secular Judaism was part of it. Remember that we invented the New Year, we invented even New Year tree instead of the Christmas tree. Yeah. We invented a lot of things just because we need, people understand, people on the top understand. Simple people need rituals. So we were working hard to replace religious rituals with secular rituals.
Yeah.
And I think it was coming actually even before Bolsheviks. It was coming from Tsarist Russia, because this band of settlement, it was applicable for religious Jews. As soon as you give up your religious views, you're not being viewed as a Jew anymore. You're like a regular guy. And guys who lived in Moscow, Leningrad, or St. Petersburg, they were Jews there, but they were not practicing Jews.
It was very hard for any Jew to come to one of these sanctuary
well,
cities.
But then
if you joined the army, for example, you could, as a veteran, you could go there.
And
but
same thing about university. As long as you, it was actually Tsarist Russia as well.
No. There was no requirement for you to convert. There was never requirement for you to convert. It was easy way out. Just like later in the 60s and 70s, joining Communist Party was your easy way to advance your career. So that was an easy way for Jews
to
advance. Just convert and all your Jewishness, all your Jewish past is erased. And
but the interesting thing about these Yiddish schools, so you're both right in that they were replacing this religious identity with the secular identity, which was grounded in Yiddish, and Jewish life in and of itself wasn't being persecuted, just that, but religious life was. And so they opened these Yiddish schools, and the message there was often distinctly anti-Judaic. The kinds of things they would teach, it was unhygienic, say, to kiss the Torah. It was unhygienic to do circumcision. They did attack Judaism and Jewish ritual on all kinds of grounds to make it seem as if the religion, to spin it as kind of this backward tribalist practice. But these Yevsek, the Jewish sections of the Communist Party, were really big on these schools. But what do you think? How do you think the Jewish parents felt about them? Any ideas?
Well, the Jewish parents who are attached to Jewish ritual would obviously not be thrilled.
Right. I mean, they didn't have much really to gain from these yeshivas, these Yiddish secular schools. In fact, enrollment in them was falling from day one. Once you divorced the education from the Judaism, you didn't have much to really grip people. And besides that, what was the point of sending your kid to a Yiddish school if they weren't going to get an education in Judaism anyway, an education in Torah? And if anything, they weren't going to be studying in the language that was going to give them a competitive advantage over everybody else who was going to be taking advantage of these new educational opportunities.
Who was teaching in these schools? I mean, you must have had secularist Jews who saw this as a mission.
Sure, I'll tell you who was teaching in one of them, because I'm gonna skip over to another story in 1979. In fact, my mother's history teacher was one of these directors of these Yiddish schools, and later he became sort of a watchdog for the party and the official spy who would go to synagogues and see what they were up to.
Would it be fair to say then, I think you were trying to make the point that these schools might have been a transitional phase. In other words, you had people deeply rooted in Yiddishkeit. Mm-hmm. So what they didn't want to do in the beginning was to literally strip them of everything. So they gave them an environment which they could maybe feel comfortable with, and it would be a temporary phenomenon, maybe a one-generational thing, and then they would transition everybody into the Russian school. you know.
Yeah.
Which may not have been anti-Jewish, because they were doing it to Georgians and
They were doing
Ukrainians,
it.
right?
The idea was really to create this secularized, secularist, proletarian, egalitarian, totally equal society within Russia. You know, as
Well,
you say,
but
the roads to hell are all paved with good intentions. The intentions were good. It's just how it eventually.
Well, what's interesting about that point is that deliberately or non-deliberately, it wasn't the Jewish communists who ended up deciding to accelerate the Russification of these Jewish kids. It was in fact the Jewish parents themselves that they set up these schools, and then the families thought, well, what's the point? Why didn't we just send them to Russian schools? So
I think you're not giving quite adequate deference, if I may say, to the theory of nationalism. The Soviet Union was comprised of 15 separate national republics plus a whole bunch of autonomous regions, and they weren't going to just Russify everyone. That was that was itself considered a deviation from.
We're talking about people in Central Asia.
I have a little request, and that is, it's very interesting to me to hear people that know so much about the history of this period. But I think that Sana's presentation is really about the scale of the individual people who went through it, and I'd rather hear more about that.
Well, we'll certainly have plenty of time for discussion.
Go on.
I like, the more interactive it is, the better I like it, because I don't want to be the only one talking. But we'll return to all these points.
When we contribute, let's not keep it at the level of the party Congress. Let's keep it at the people that lived it.
Well, in terms of what else was going on, and we're talking about in Central Asia, you had peoples who had an oral language, and the Soviets were coming up with alphabets for their national languages. So they weren't like we said before, they weren't trying to Russify all these cultures at once. They knew they couldn't. It just wasn't possible. So okay, let's see. Okay. So people started taking their kids out of these schools, sending them to Russian and Ukrainian schools, and once these Jews had started getting secular educations in Russian or Ukrainian, they started to regard the shtetl life of their parents and grandparents as no longer relevant to them and as backwards. So they in a sense graduated from Yiddish culture to Russian culture. And young Jews started entering the party in large numbers. What were some of the ways that they started entering the party? Well, I'll give you examples from my family. My grandmother was a volunteer in the army. She entered while she was in the army. She was what you might call a true believer. My grandfather entered for much more pragmatic reasons. He was a construction engineer, and he started getting promoted to managing construction crews. And he understood that if he wanted to keep getting promoted, it wasn't going to be possible. Without party membership, somebody from his organization asked him if he would submit to join, and he did. So this is how these people became products of the Soviet system. There was another interesting way that people started joining the party, and that was, the idea of socialism was to get rid of class, but it didn't get rid of class. It just tipped the class pyramid on its head. What did that mean? Universities had aggressive affirmative action programs, but it had to do with class as opposed to race. And it looked very good to come from, say, worker background. Not as good to have peasant background, because for some reason the communists assumed that people who were from agrarian backgrounds had kind of these acquisitive urges that would lead them down the path to small-scale capitalism. And for Jews who had been living in the Pale of Settlement, what did they do for a living? They were small-scale artisans, shoemakers, roofers, small traders. Many of them were self-employed, so technically they would be considered bourgeois. In reality, they were barely scraping out a living. But after the revolution, they all had these very unattractive class backgrounds. So how did you erase your class background? Well, in order for a young person from one of these families, and this stuff was stamped in your passports, or it was on your documents. It was hard to hide. And this isn't like a passport in America, just has your picture and your birth date. I mean, a Russian passport is going to have how many times you were married and divorced. This is not a society that really appreciates privacy very much.